Okay, let me ask you something, like right off the bat. Would you shock a stranger until they screamed? Just because, someone told you to. It sounds like something out of a chilling psychological thriller, doesn't it?
It really does. A dark fantasy almost.
Yeah. But this isn't hypothetical, is it? It's actually a profound, deeply uncomfortable question about human behavior. And it's right at the core of our deep dive today. We're about to confront that real tension between obedience and, well, your own conscience.
That internal conflict.
Exactly. And I'll say it's not an easy topic to unpack. It might feel pretty unsettling.
It often does.
But understanding it feels vital, really vital for making sense of ourselves, our choices, the world.
It really is. It reveals this hidden architecture of influence, you could say, that shapes so much of what we do, often without us realizing it. And to help us navigate this tricky landscape, we're drawing heavily from a really fascinating piece of work. It's by Michael Aponte called The Shock Heard Around the World. And his work delves with just remarkable insight into humanity's startling capacity for what some might call, well, blind obedience.
Blind obedience, yeah.
But Aponte meticulously explores just how far we, as individuals, might actually go when faced with an authority figure, or even just intense group pressure, telling us basically, just follow orders.
Just follow orders.
So our mission today, really, is to unpack those psychological forces.
Yeah.
What's happening when our sense of right and wrong, that internal compass, collides head-on with authority or the pressure of the group. We'll look at the historical insights, which are foundational here, and then maybe surprisingly connect them to their modern-day echoes, which are incredibly relevant and sometimes, unsettling.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And I think the best way is to really try and step into the shoes, the uncomfortable shoes, of someone in that famous study, the Milgram experiment.
Yes, the classic.
So imagine you volunteered for what sounds like a pretty standard study, right? Memory and learning. Maybe you saw a flyer at a university. Maybe you needed a few bucks.
Seems harmless enough. Mundane, even.
Totally. So you arrive, and you're greeted by a man in a crisp white lab coat. Looks very official, maybe a bit serious. The picture of scientific authority.
The symbolism is important.
He explains the setup, the study's purpose, all sounds legit. And then he leads you into a room, and you sit down in front of this machine. It looks formidable, a shock generator. It looks incredibly real.
And that sense of absolute realism was paramount. It was meticulously designed. For the participants, every detail, every little cue was crafted to make them believe, like 100%, that they were delivering genuine shocks.
Getting more and more painful.
Exactly. And potentially lethal. They were told it was about punishment and learning. They drew lots, seemingly, and got the role of teacher.
Right.
The learner, actually an actor, a kind of friendly-looking middle-aged guy, was strapped into a chair next door, electrodes attached, all very visible to the participant.
They saw him get strapped in.
Yes. And his reactions, the grunts, the shouts, the eventual screams, all simulated, but utterly, utterly convincing.
Wow. So they had no reason to doubt it was real.
None whatsoever.
Okay, so here you are, the teacher, in front of this machine. Switch is clearly labeled, right? Starting low, slight shock, maybe 15 volts. Then moderate, strong, climbing up, 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 all the way to this terrifying XX 450 volts.
Ominously marks not just numbers, but danger signs, too.
Yeah, like danger, severe shock, and then just XXX. Chilling.
Right.
And the man in the lab coat, the authority figure, is right there standing beside you, impassive.
Just observing, calmly.
And his instructions are simple, almost robotic. Administer a shock to the learner every time they get a question wrong. And then, well, it begins.
The procedure starts.
First few shocks, low voltage. You hear the learner, maybe a little grunt, an uncomfortable sound, nothing too bad.
Manageable, perhaps?
Yeah. You keep going. Learner gets some wrong, you flip the next switch. And the next, but then the voltage climbs. You hear a louder grunt. Then, a definite shout, followed by complaints. Something about a heart condition?
The stakes are rising.
Your hand probably hesitates then, right? Over the switch?
You'd think so. You'd hope so.
Then it gets worse. Horrifyingly, actual screams of pain from the next room. He's pleading to be let out, complaining about the pain, the heart. You hesitate, definitely hesitate now. Your stomach's probably churning, maybe you're sweating.
Signs of extreme stress were very common.
Hands trembling, maybe.
Yeah.
You look over at the man in the white lab coat, kind of hoping he'll say, okay, that's enough. A silent plea.
Exactly. And this is where the core dilemma just crystallizes. The participant The teacher is undeniably distressed. They believe they're causing real harm, escalating harm.
Yeah.
Their conscience, that basic sense of right and wrong, it's screaming, stop.
Right.
Yet when they look to the authority, the lab coat guy, he's calm, composed, and passive.
Doesn't react to the screams at all.
No. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't threaten. He just calmly repeats these prescripted lines, these prods, like, please continue.
Please continue.
Or, as the teacher gets more upset, the experiment requires that you continue.
Oh, man.
If they object more strongly, it escalates.
Yeah.
It is absolutely essential that you continue.
Essential. Wow.
And the final one, if they really push back, you have no other choice. You must go on.
You have no other choice.
The internal conflict becomes immense, a real battle. Your morals versus this demand.
So what do you do? I mean, what do you do when your conscience is screaming louder than the learner, when everything inside you says, this is wrong, so wrong, but the authority figure, Mr. Labcoat, insists you have no other choice?
That is the terrifying question, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's what Michael Aponte's work, The Shock Heard Around the World, explores so deeply. And the answer Milgram found, that Aponte analyzes, it's just unsettling. It really challenges how we think about ourselves.
It absolutely does. And this is the core finding, the one that stunned people and still does. A staggering 65%. 2/3 of the participants
65
continued to administer what they believe were potentially lethal shocks. They went all the way to the maximum, 450 volts, marked X.
Wow. Even believing it could kill someone.
Believing it entirely. And crucially, this wasn't easy for them. They weren't callous. No, far from it. The records show them sweating, trembling, stuttering, arguing. Some even had nervous laughter, trying to cope.
But they still did it.
They still did it. Deeply conflicted, but they obeyed.
What?
In some versions, even when the learner went completely silent, suggesting unconsciousness or worse.
Oh, God.
A significant number still administered the maximum shock.
Yeah.
Just because the authorities said to.
That's beyond belief, almost.
It wasn't about a lack of feeling. It was about something powerful overriding that feeling.
Isn't it just terrifying how quickly people can apparently silence their own conscience, that inner voice, just when faced with someone who looks like they're in charge?
It makes you pause, definitely.
Are we all just, one lab coat away from doing something horrible, something against our core values? It's a chilling thought.
Well, what's really fascinating here, and maybe the most uncomfortable part, is that these weren't bad people. They weren't outliers or sociopaths.
They were just normal people.
Exactly. Ordinary people.
Yeah.
Teachers, engineers, workers, drawn from all walks of life, like you, like me.
Okay.
And that's what we have to confront, these powerful, innate psychological mechanisms inside all of us. Mechanisms that can lead to this kind of blind obedience under the right or maybe the wrong conditions.
So it's not a character flaw. It's something situational, human.
It's about universal human tendencies, patterns of thinking and behaving that get activated by situational pressures. It reveals a kind of fundamental vulnerability in how we make decisions.
Okay, so if it's not about people being evil, how does it happen? How do normal people do things they know are wrong even when they're obviously upset about it?
Right, how does that shift occur?
Yeah.
Well, Michael Aponte in The Shock Heard Around the World really digs into these underlying mechanisms. He explains how they transform, good intentions or moral feelings into actions that seem to contradict them. And these aren't just theories in a book. They're powerful forces shaping our choices all the time, often invisibly.
Okay, like what are these mechanisms?
Well, the first really crucial one is called the agentic state.
Agentic state, okay.
In this state, people stop seeing themselves as independent actors making their own moral choices. Instead, they see themselves as instruments, just tools carrying out someone else's will.
Like a cog in a machine.
Precisely. They effectively hand over personal responsibility for their actions to the authority figure.
So they tell themselves, I'm just doing my job, or it's not my fault.
Exactly that. I'm just following orders. The person in charge is responsible, not me. And this psychological shift is incredibly powerful because it kind of disarms your own moral judgment.
How so?
Well, if you don't feel personally responsible for the outcome, you don't engage your own ethics in the same way, right? Your sense of right and wrong gets sidelined.
Okay. That makes a scary kind of sense.
In the Milgram study, you heard participants saying things like, I was just following orders, or telling the experimenter, it's your responsibility. It wasn't just an excuse after the fact. It reflected their mental state during the experiment.
And you see this elsewhere too, right? Not just in labs.
Oh, constantly. Think about bureaucratic situations, military contexts. The infamous defense of Adolf Eichmann, who managed the logistics for the Holocaust, was exactly this. I was just following orders.
Chilling.
Profoundly disturbing, yes. But it illustrates the agentic state taken to its absolute extreme. You psychologically distance yourself from the consequences by seeing yourself as just an instrument. You outsource the morality.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot to take in. It feels like a way to numb yourself to what you're doing. But still, here's the thing that gets me. Jumping straight to 450 volts, that feels like a huge leap, even if you're shifting blame. It wasn't like they started there, right? There must have been a buildup.
Exactly right. And that brings us straight to the second mechanism, which is just as insidious, really. It's incremental compliance, often called the slippery slope.
The slippery slope? Yeah, I've heard that term.
It's a powerful idea that taking small, seemingly insignificant steps makes much bigger, more extreme actions easier down the line.
Because you've already started down the path.
Precisely. Think about it. If Milgram had said, right, first instruction, give this guy 450 volts, what would have happened?
Nobody would do it. Or almost nobody. It's too big a jump.
Exactly. It's a moral chasm. But that's not how it worked. It started small, 15 volts, then 30, tiny increments. Each switch was just one more, just a little bit more than the last one.
Which just seems so bad.
Right. Because the previous shock wasn't a catastrophe. The next small step feels less daunting, less significant.
It normalizes it, step by step.
Perfectly put. It normalizes behavior that would be unthinkable if presented all at once. It's like that analogy about boiling a frog slowly.
Yeah, put it in cool water and heat it up gradually.
Right. The change is so slow, the frog doesn't realize the danger until it's too late.
Whereas if you dropped it in boiling water, it'd jump right out.
Exactly. Each small step, once you take it and rationalize it, makes the next step feel like less of a big deal. Until suddenly you're at a place you never imagined, doing things you never thought you could.
You see that in everyday life too, don't you? Small compromises adding up.
All the time. The little request at work that grows into something unethical, the tiny lie that leads to bigger ones. It's a very common human pattern.
Okay, so it's not just fear of authority or shifting responsibility via the agentic state, or even just the slippery slope. It also sounds like how the whole action is presented, how it's framed, is crucial.
Absolutely crucial. And that brings us to the third powerful mechanism, moral framing.
Moral framing, yeah.
Michael Aponte's work really highlights this. Obedience is often positioned not just as compliance, but as something virtuous, necessary, even protective.
So you make the bad thing seem like a good thing, or at least a necessary thing.
Precisely. It's about making the act of obeying seem morally defensible, maybe even noble, which then overrides your personal ethical objections.
How did that work in Milgram?
Well, the authority figure kept framing it as being for the good of science, emphasizing how important the research was.
Ah, the greater good argument.
Exactly. He wasn't asking them to be cruel, you see. He was asking them to contribute to scientific understanding.
Which sounds much better.
Much better. And this moral framing can powerfully override personal ethics. If you believe you're serving some higher purpose, science, security, the company, the country, then the harmful act can be rationalized, even feel like a duty.
It taps into our desire to be good, right? To do the right thing.
Absolutely. And it helps resolve cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling when your actions clash with your beliefs.
Yeah.
If you reframe the action as moral or necessary, the dissonance dissolves. Obedience feels less like a transgression, more like fulfilling an obligation.
Wow.
Aponte actually poses a really sharp reflection question in his work. How does moral framing shape your readiness to obey?
Oof. Yeah, that hits home.
It forces us to think about how often we just accept the frame someone else gives us for an action without really questioning it.
And how that frame then dictates our response.
Often, without us even realizing we're being manipulated by the narrative, we think we're acting morally, but we're just obeying a script that serves someone else's agenda, potentially leading us to support things we normally find awful.
Okay, these three mechanisms, the agentic state, incremental compliance, moral framing, they feel incredibly powerful, like invisible threads pulling us. And it just makes you think, how do these play out beyond the lab, beyond Milgram? Where else do we see these patterns? Because it feels like they're everywhere, even without the lab coat and the shock machine.
You're absolutely right. They are everywhere. And Aponte, in his analysis, definitely extends beyond the lab. He shows how these exact same patterns of obedience and conformity show up powerfully in the real world, especially in the dynamics of cults and also broader phenomena like groupthink.
Cults and groupthink. Okay.
In those settings, you see similar strategies at play, just as effective, maybe even more so because they're integrated into people's lives.
So how does that look?
Well, first, think about the role of charismatic leaders in cults.
Right. They always seem to have one.
These aren't just leaders. They often have this magnetic pull. They inspire intense devotion, command unwavering loyalty. They tap into deep human needs, belonging, purpose, meaning, safety, and offer grand promises, simple answers.
Which is very appealing when you feel lost or vulnerable.
Incredibly appealing. It creates this powerful emotional bond, makes followers highly susceptible to their directives, no matter how irrational or harmful they might seem from the outside.
The leader becomes the ultimate authority. Their word is law.
Essentially, yes. Their vision becomes the only reality. And disagreeing isn't just disagreeing, it's betrayal, it's a threat.
Which leads to suppressing dissent.
Directly. To maintain that kind of extreme cohesion you see in cults, or even in strong groupthink environments, you have to silence questioning voices.
How do they do that?
Various ways. Shaming, isolation, psychological pressure, public humiliation, sometimes much worse.
So people become afraid to speak up.
Exactly. It becomes incredibly difficult to voice doubts, to think critically, or even consider alternatives. It triggers that spiral of silence effect.
Spiral of silence.
Yeah, where if you think your view is in the minority, you're less likely to say it out loud for fear of isolation. So the dominant view seems even stronger than it is. The pressure to conform becomes immense. Questioning the group feels like questioning your own identity.
Creates a real echo chamber.
A powerful one. And then there's fear control.
Fear. That seems key.
Absolutely potent. And it's not always physical threat. It's fear of being kicked out, fear of losing salvation, fear of some external enemy the leader identifies.
Or just fear of the unknown outside the group.
Right. Fear that only the group or the leader can protect you from. When people are operating out of that deep fear, their critical thinking just tanks.
They'll cling to whatever promises safety.
No matter how extreme. Because the alternative seems even more terrifying.
And all this, the leader, the silence, the fear,
Right.
It leads to people becoming really diehard defenders.
Incredibly loyal defenders.
Yeah.
Even of ideas or practices that seem clearly harmful or bizarre to outsiders. Once their identity is totally wrapped up in the group, its beliefs, the leader,
Yeah.
they become fanatical defenders.
It's not necessarily because they're bad people.
Not necessarily. It's the power of that group identity, conformity, the psychological investment. The group's truth becomes everything, overriding individual morality or contrary evidence.
They might even start dehumanizing outsiders.
Often happens. It's called outgroup derogation. Makes it easier to justify negative actions against those who aren't us.
Wow. That's, a really disturbing picture of how groups can work. But let's shift gears slightly to something maybe even more common, more part of our daily lives now. Politics. How do these same forces show up there? Because the lines get drawn so sharply, ideologies feel almost sacred sometimes. Identity and politics seem totally tangled.
That's a crucial application, and Aponte addresses it directly. He talks about political obedience as identity.
Political obedience as identity.
Okay, it describes this phenomenon of deep, sometimes blind, loyalty to political leaders, parties, ideologies, where your sense of self, who you are, gets fundamentally tied to your political side.
It's not just what you think, it's your identity, your tribe.
Exactly. It becomes a core part of who you are. Your moral standing, your social circle, it defines you. And this often leads to that stark tribal split. The other side isn't just wrong. They're framed as fundamentally immoral, dangerous, evil even.
Yeah, you hear that rhetoric. If you're not with us, you're immoral.
That kind of extreme moral framing demonizes opposing views.
Yeah.
It makes reasoned debate, finding common ground, almost impossible.
Because disagreeing isn't just a difference of opinion.
It's portrayed as a moral failing, a betrayal, wickedness, or stupidity, which makes it incredibly hard, psychologically, to question your own side, your own identity. You risk being cast out.
And in today's world, technology plays a role here too, right? Algorithms, social media.
A huge role,
Yeah.
almost central. Aponte points this out too. These platforms are often designed to maximize engagement, right? And they tend to amplify stuff that confirms your existing beliefs.
The echo chamber effect.
Precisely. Or filter bubbles. You're constantly fed information that validates your side and demonizes the other.
While suppressing different views.
Exactly. You rarely encounter challenging perspectives or complex realities that might make you question things.
Which makes independent critical thought really, really difficult.
Extremely difficult. Your loyalty, your obedience to your political identity just gets stronger and stronger. It's a feedback loop.
So the digital world becomes this engine for tribal conformity, reinforcing that our side is right and moral.
Making dissent feel dangerous, even immoral, ensuring you stick with the group's truth.
Okay. Wow. So considering all this Milgram, the agentic state, slippery slope, moral framing, cults, political tribes, it feels almost inevitable to connect it to recent history, to the pandemic, especially since Aponte himself draws that parallel, suggesting that the global compliance mirrored Milgram's findings during COVID.
Yes, he makes that explicit connection.
And just to be really clear here, we're not aiming to judge the pandemic responses themselves or take sides. It's about using that shared, intense global experience as a case study, looking at it through this specific lens of obedience and these psychological mechanisms.
Exactly. It's an objective lens, using it as a case study. And when you do that, the parallels are quite striking.
Okay, like what parallels stand out?
Well, first think about the immense trust placed in institutions.
Right. The CDC, the WHO, national health bodies.
For huge numbers of people, these became the ultimate authority figures, kind of like the lab coat in Milgram.
Yeah, I can see that.
Their guidance, even when it changed rapidly or seemed contradictory at times,
Which it definitely did.
was often accepted by large parts of the population without much individual questioning. It heavily influenced behavior globally.
People deferred to the experts, believed they had the answers.
Believed following was the responsible thing to do in a crisis. Then second, you had the immense power of social pressure and fear.
Oh, yeah. Fear was massive.
Fear of the virus itself, getting sick, dying, infecting others, that was real and pervasive, combined with intense social pressure to conform to the measures. Masks, distancing, lockdowns, later vaccines.
You had to show you were doing your part.
Exactly. It wasn't just about rules, it was about avoiding threats, showing solidarity, being seen as responsible. That fear, amplified by media and messaging, made conformity feel like the safest, most moral, sometimes the only socially acceptable path.
It taps into that need to belong, to be accepted.
Definitely. Normative social influence. And just doing what everyone else seems to be doing.
And what about dissent? If people did question things?
Well, mirroring those cult and groupthink dynamics, dissent was often shamed or silenced.
Yeah, you definitely saw that online and elsewhere.
Questioning official narratives, doubting mandates, proposing alternatives,
Yeah,
you could quickly get labeled.
right. Misinformed, selfish, dangerous, anti-science, anti-vaxxer.
All those labels. This social shaming, the risk of being ostracized, created a huge disincentive for public dissent.
Made it really hard for different ideas to even be heard, let alone discussed.
Exactly. It suppressed critical inquiry, reinforced the dominant narrative, pushed uncomfortable questions aside, much like in other high-conformity groups.
It really does make you wonder, doesn't it, that fear. It's such a powerful leash, a real tool for compliance. And you feel like some people wore it willingly, maybe out of genuine, deep concern for others, wanting to protect people, or maybe just that powerful desire to belong, to be seen as a good person doing the right thing in a crisis.
It's such a complex mix of motivations.
Yeah. The line between acting morally and just obeying seems so blurry sometimes.
Or maybe look at it from another angle, equally human. Perhaps it was fundamentally about seeking safety and certainty.
In a time that felt anything but safe or certain.
Exactly. Unprecedented uncertainty, constant anxiety, rapid change. In that environment, many people just wanted to feel good about their choices, feel secure, feel like they were on the right path,
Yeah.
even more than needing to be factually correct about every single evolving guideline.
That drive for certainty, for a clear path, is strong.
Incredibly strong. So maybe people embraced the prescribed path even as it shifted, because sticking with it offered a sense of security, a moral clarity that questioning just couldn't provide.
Which brings up the point about the guidance changing so much.
Yes, and Aponte highlights this specifically, the evolving and often contradictory guidance.
Masks, testing, origins, all sorts of things shifted.
Right. And those frequent changes, the contradictions sometimes, they really underlined that compliance often seemed driven less by stable scientific fact and more by emotion, social cohesion, the desire for safety, the desire for it all to just end.
When the facts themselves seemed fluid.
Obeying the current authority, the latest instruction, might have felt psychologically safer than trying to figure it out yourself or questioning.
Questioning felt risky. Socially, maybe even physically.
Could lead to that cognitive dissonance, isolation, feeling exposed. Aponte's reflection question here is so relevant for all of us looking back. In the past 3 years, where have you seen group obedience override personal judgment?
Oof. Yeah, that requires some honest reflection.
It invites us to think about our own experiences, our observations, knowing how complex human behavior really is, often driven by forces much deeper than just logic.
Wow. Okay, so this entire deep dive, drawing on Michael Aponte's The Shock Heard Around the World, it really leaves us wrestling with that central, challenging question, doesn't it? How far would you go just following orders?
It hangs in the air.
It really does. It forces you to look inward, confront your own tendencies. Think about those subtle pressures shaping us all the time. And maybe the follow-up question is, what if the next order you follow, whether it's from a boss, a government, a social media trend, whatever, what if it inadvertently hurts someone else? Or, just as importantly, what if it hurts you by stopping you from thinking critically, by silencing your own conscience, eroding your own judgment?
These aren't just lab scenarios. They're real dilemmas we face constantly.
Absolutely.
And that's the real point of understanding all this. The goal isn't to make everyone cynical or distrustful of everything.
No, right.
No. The purpose, and I think Aponte's intention too, is to cultivate awareness. Discernment. It's about recognizing these powerful psychological forces at play, not just out there, but inside ourselves.
Knowing they exist is the first step.
Exactly. And then finding the courage, because it really does take courage sometimes to pause, to question, to think for yourself.
Even when it's uncomfortable or goes against the grain.
Especially then, even when it means standing apart from the group. In this world just flooded with information and misinformation and influence, that ability to think independently, to hold on to your values, to assess critically, it's more vital than ever.
Yeah, it really, really is. This is the deep dive, because sometimes thinking for yourself is the most radical act. And we really want to extend a huge thank you to Michael Aponte, the author of The Shock Heard Around the World. Just fantastic, insightful work.
Truly thought-provoking.
And thank you for letting us be part of the Thinking to Think community. It's great to explore these ideas together. If this deep dive sparked something for you, if it got you thinking, maybe arguing back a little, please, you know the drill, subscribe, give us a like, share the deep dive with other people who appreciate digging into these crucial, sometimes tough, but always important topics.
Help spread the conversation.
Yeah. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and above all, keep thinking for yourself.